Welcome, my friends, to today's Zero to Hero crash course on HTML and CSS. There is no prerequisite coding knowledge required for this course, so if you're new to HTML and CSS or just looking to improve, then this course is for you. As for the outline of the video, we'll start off by taking a big picture overview at what HTML and CSS actually are, how they work. Then we'll learn the basics, the essentials of each of them. And finally, we'll put all this new knowledge to good use by building out the Google search homepage, which is a website trafficked by millions of people every single day. With that all complete, you'll be able to create your very own responsive and professional websites from scratch, have them live hosted on the internet, and you can send them to all your family and friends to show off your new skills. There's going to be lots of tips and tricks shared along the way, and at the very end of the video, there's a special announcement, so be sure to stick around for that. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and with that said, let's get started. So chapter 1 of this video, we're going to start off taking a high-level overview at HTML and CSS, what they do and how they work. And the way that we're going to do that is actually by building a Google document. HTML and CSS essentially just represent a glorified Word document. So if we can start thinking about HTML and the way that we put together a Word document, that's going to help you gain a really deep understanding of how HTML actually works and save you a whole lot of memorization of the different tags because it will just make sense, it'll be intuitive. So just here, we're going to start off making this document. We're just going to call it Intro to Web Dev. Now, the first thing we'd probably do when we were creating a document is put in the title. Now, this is the exact same thing in HTML, just done slightly differently, which we will see soon. The second thing we could have is a subtitle, and underneath that we could have this is my first heading. And we can set this, we can format it to be our heading number 1. Now, if we take a second to come up to this title, we can see that the title element automatically fills the title of the document, and it even dictates the title of our web page just up the top here. So titles are very important. Now, underneath our heading, we could have subheading 1 and subheader 2. Likewise, both things we can do inside of HTML2. And in here we might have, this is my first paragraph, and similar with the second one. And we're going to set that to normal text because it's just, unformatted basic text. Likewise, in our document, we might want a picture of a duck. So let me just copy that image. We can paste it in here and have this image. We could also insert a link to the image. So we can select that text there. We can right click, insert the link, and we can copy the link directly from the web page. So we can paste that straight in and apply that. Likewise, you can do the exact same thing in a web page. And even more than just these little elements, the header text, the text formatting in general, we can also learn about sectioning our HTML documents in here. For example, we can insert a header and a footer. The header could have title number 1. We could tab all the way across and have link 1 and tab and have link 2. That might be pretty familiar to the header of an HTML document. We can do the exact same with a footer that has all my contact information, and that's going to stay down the bottom of the document. And all of this information just here that is in between the header and the footer of our document is what we call the main information, or the main section of our document. So here I could say main starts, and down the bottom I could say main ends. And literally just like that, we have introduced ourselves inadvertently to a whole lot of HTML. We have our header element, header being the keyword because that's literally the HTML tag. We have the main section, which wraps all of our main content. And then we also have the footer content. If we take a look at this entire document in general, this whole thing is referred to as the body. Now, this is called the body as opposed to the head, where the head of the document is different to the header. This is the header. The head contains meta information about the document, such as the title. So essentially, when we create our HTML document, we have the head, which contains the title. Then we have the body of the document. We have the header, we have the main, then we have the footer, and then we just basically fill out all of the information within those sections using a few more tags, and we have an HTML document. So whenever you're creating an HTML website for the first time, just think of your standard document, Word document, start building it in a very similar vein, and you will get some great HTML code. Now that we've looked at the similarities between a Word document and a HTML document, what are the differences? The first one is responsivity. So here we see that if I resize my web page, the static Word document has a fixed width, and so it doesn't respond to that. Now, HTML allows us to create web pages that are responsive and will respond to the changing width of the screen. The second thing is that this content is very static. So if we were to imagine that a web page was just the cutout of the body of this document, we can see that it's all fixed content. There's not really any interaction areas. And if we were just reading through this, it's the same content every time we visit the web page. So that's what's known as a static web page, where coding in HTML allows us to add a bit more dynamic information. If we were to build this in HTML, we could add more dynamic elements such as inputs or buttons or all that kind of stuff. And if we included JavaScript, we can really start to handle a lot of user interaction with the web page, which you can't do in a document. Now, the last thing that's really different, that is probably the biggest thing that differentiates the two, is the way that we construct these pages. Here I have simply inserted a header, I've clicked on this and formatted it using some buttons, whereas in HTML we use HTML tags to tell the page what sections do. And the way that tags work is very equivalent to the way that quotations work. If I have a quote here, the first thing that we notice about this quote is that it has an opening and closing quotation mark. Everything wrapped within these two quotation marks, we can infer that this is something someone is saying, it's a quote from a particular person, and we can distinguish it from the rest of the document, which is static information, because of these two quotations. HTML works the exact same way, where we create meaning on our page, where instead of using the standard characters or, clicking to format a section to a header section, we use tags. So in this particular case, I could use a quotation tag. This is a quote. And then I could use the complementary closing tag to wrap this information, and in an HTML web page, this would be rendered out the exact same way, except we have coded it in HTML instead of just plain English. There is a tag that exists for everything we have done in this example, such as this title right here. We can achieve the exact same thing inside of HTML by having intro to web dev and just wrapping it inside of opening and closing tags. The opening tag is the tag, so if it's a title element, we just use the two alligator mouths on either side of the word, and the closing tag is the exact same thing, except it has a slash in front of the keyword or the type of tag that it is. Numerous tags that you can use, but for this tutorial, we're just going to focus on the basic ones, and we can split these up into a couple of categories. So first we have text tags. So obviously we have the quotation one down below, but that's not that common of an example. The main ones are header tags. So here is an H1 tag, and this would be equivalent to what we've done right here, having our first heading. So in HTML, if we wanted to create this effect and have this big emboldened text, we would use the H1 opening and closing tags. Now there are 6 tiers of header tags, just like here we have 3. In HTML, you get 6, so you can have an H2, you can have an H3, H4, H5, and H6, and each of them has a closing tag that is exactly the same. And we also have a paragraph tag for content that is nothing more than what we have right here. This is my first paragraph. So all bodies of text are wrapped inside tags that represent what they are. Just like in here, I can select this is normal text and this is, heading number 2. After that, we have what I refer to as container tags. Now, container tags are similar to what we have discussed, such as the body. We can close the body. And so if we recall from a minute ago, I said that the body represents this entire document and that its counterpart was the head, which contained the meta information about the document. So we can also have the head tag right there. Always have to have an opening and closing tag. They have to be complementary. If the body is our entire document and we have some stuff inside it, we can put that inside of the body, just like we literally put it inside of the body here. And we said that at the top we have a header. So we can have a header opening and closing tag. Inside here, we have that H2 up the top, which is this title number 1. So we can have title number 1 just like that, have the opening and closing tags, the complementary versions. We also have the links over there. Now, links are typically referred to inside of a navigation tag because they represent navigation abilities, just like I could click here and it might take me to a particular section or to my resume, for example. So we can have a navigation tag, and I can close that. After the header of the document, we might have the main section of the document. So we have the main content. And then finally, after the main, as we saw, we have the footer, which is right down the bottom. And as per usual, we have the opening and closing footer tags. So the structure of the HTML that we've ended up writing here is exactly the same to the way that you would format a Word document. So whenever you start writing your new HTML projects, you just want to think Word document, how do I format them? And just to add that, that should be in there. We have the title tag. Now, these are some, but not all of the container tags. The other ones that we're going to focus on in this tutorial is the section tag. So just like in here, we have, this is my first heading. This is the subheader. This subheader information right here represents a section of the document. Subheader 2 might also represent a section of the document. So we can containerize those sections inside of the main content of our document using the section tag. And inside each of these section tags, we have to make sure we have the closing one to wrap that content. Inside of here, we can have that H header 3 or header 2 or whatever it was. Subheader 1, we can pop that in there, have the closing tag as well. And then we could have a paragraph tag underneath, and this has some paragraph information in it. This is the paragraph. Now, inside of sections, sometimes you want to split up content even further. And, we really want to embrace the idea of containerizing our applications because it just makes your code super clean. So a smaller container separation than a section is going to be a division. So we divide our content. And so for that, we have a div tag. And so here, for example, we could have a div tag, always has to be the opening and closing. And perhaps we just have multiple paragraphs within that division. So the section is broken up into a header, which itself could be inside a div. So we could have 2 major divisions within our section. Each of them is contained within a div, where the first division contains our header for the section, and the second one contains our 3 paragraph tags. So once again, all about containerizing our information. Now the final one for container tags, sections of our document, spacious sections, is a span. And spans are typically for inline containerization. So if we had a paragraph and we wanted to have a space division inside of it, or some separation inside of our paragraph, we use a span tag because it spans a small horizontal section most typically. One thing to note is that we cannot have big container tags that contain information inside of a paragraph, so instead we would have to use the span. Now, once again, you don't have to soak all of this up. It's just good to kind of understand that we want to start thinking about HTML documents as we do Word documents. Finally, after all of our container tags, we have some utility tags. The major utility tags that we're going to be looking at in this one is the image tag. Now, the image tag is special because it's a self-closing tag, so we don't have to have an opening and closing version. And instead, all we do is we pass in a source, which is typically a link to the file. We can also pass in what's called an alt, which is just, nomenclature for describing what this particular image is for, visually impaired screen readers or anything. Image of a duck, for example. And one thing to note about the self-closing tag is that it doesn't contain any information between the opening and closing tag. Instead, the information is actually in this small space here. Anything that goes in this space, and this is only available or something you can do with an opening tag, is called an attribute. So in here we have the attribute source, which finds the link to the image, and the value of that attribute is whatever is on the other side of the equals. So this attribute is equivalent to this value. This is a secondary attribute. There are some custom attributes that you can create, and there are some that are, special and built into most of these tags. The next utility tag we're going to be looking at is the input tag. Once again, this is self-closing, and this just creates an input field where people can write into your website. This one typically contains a value attribute and also a placeholder attribute. Once again, you don't have to remember any of this. This will come into practice. It's just good to be familiar with. If we have a lot of inputs, we typically add them inside of a form tag because it's essentially a form that we're getting people to fill out. So that's just another container tag that I missed from before. And outside of that, we have a button tag. So the button, as you guessed it, is for creating a button on the screen that has a click functionality. Just like at the bottom of a form, we might have a push to submit. And finally, we also have an anchor tag, which does contain information. So we could say click here, and we can provide a link, which is known as an href. And we could say smalljames.com. So the href is the attribute. This is what shows on the page. And the whole anchor tag shows up just like we have this link right here. It's exactly the same thing, and it's an anchor to a different page, just in the same way this link right here anchors me to this website. Now, once again, this is totally not responsive, and so that's where CSS comes in with web pages. We can style all of these elements as we choose, make them look as pretty as we want, and that is done with CSS, which is cascading style sheets. And we have about 16 primary styles that we'll be applying to style our Google homepage. But anyway, that pretty much ends our introduction to chapter 1, which is understanding what HTML is. Just remember, think structured Word document, and your HTML code will just come to life. Anyway, that pretty much brings chapter 1 to the end, where the major takeaways are that when we create websites, we're essentially just creating Word documents, except we're using tags to separate and contain information so that the web page can infer meaning and display them accordingly. We have container tags, we have text tags, and we have some utility tags, and all of them are used in conjunction with one another to create a really nicely formatted document, just like we would an essay. With that all said, let's dive into chapter 2. So now that we have the basic concept of HTML and CSS down, it's time to actually start coding with it on our computer. And to do that, you will need some kind of code editor. Now, my recommendation is Visual Studio Code. If you type that in on Google, come through to the web page, equally the links will be in the description down below. You can install it on virtually any device. And once it's installed, you should be able to open up a Visual Studio Code window. It should look something a bit like this. Over here on the left-hand side, we have project directories. So here what I've done is I've created a folder called HTML demo. You can just create this in any window and open it up inside of your Visual Studio Code using this little open right here. And inside of this directory on the side, we can go ahead and create our first HTML file. We're going to call it index.html. So the .html suffix means that our code editor will recognize that this is an HTML file. Now one little tip that's nice to know is that if you open up a terminal down the bottom, in here there's 3 commands that are often worth knowing. The first one is cd, which means change directory, so that can be good for navigating between directories inside of your terminal. The second one is make directory, so this is for creating a folder within the folder that we are in currently. So I could make a directory called test, and we can see that a folder called test opens up on the side. And the last one is a touch command. If I say touch and then name the file styles.css, that's going to go ahead and initialize that file just there for us. Equally, you can right click, create a new file, and do exactly the same thing. It's just a nice fun little way to do it programmatically. Now, once we're inside of this index.html, this is where we can go ahead and type all those tags as we did inside of our demonstration just here. But obviously the thing that we don't have here is that, I can type all these tags, but I can't see it as a web page. So the way that we get a web page to display, let's say I have an H2 tag that says hello world. That's a pretty common first thing to do. What we can do is we can say reveal in Finder, so we can access the folder directory just here. So I can see I have my index.html or styles.css in my random folder, which I'll move to the trash. If I wanted to display this HTML document as a web page to see what it looks like while developing, I can take this file and drag it over my Chrome browser, and my Chrome browser will literally recognize it as a website and display hello world in a header 2 style. That's pretty similar to the way that we had our header 2s in here. So this is the second heading. We could come back into our document and add a paragraph tag, for example, and say this is a paragraph. Save that, and once again drag that file back there, and it's going to now show the paragraph text. And you can see that instead of highlighting some words and entering them in and then selecting the formatting, so like we did in here, we click this, we click on the heading and we select a format for it. In HTML, we use the opening and closing tags to allow the browser to infer what each thing is. So we use the H2 instead of, highlighting it and selecting which one it should be. Now, it's a bit annoying to have to drag and drop stuff into your browser every single time, but there's actually a better way to make it so that every time we change our document, the web page reloads. And to do that, we're going to come over to the extensions inside of Visual Studio Code. And in here, we're going to search for one called Live Server. It's just this top one right here. And you're going to want to install that on inside of your Visual Studio Code editor. And what that will allow us to do once installed is we can right click on our document and select Open with Live Server. Equally, there's a button down the bottom that says Go Live, but we're just going to right click Open with Live Server, and that's going to initialize the page just here so we can see it right there. And now if I move this to the side, keep this over here, and let's say I readjust this window. Let's say I add another paragraph that says second paragraph, keeping in mind that I have the opening and then the closing tag, and save that. I can now just refresh the page over here and it reloads the document in. It saves me having to do the drag and drop every time, so that's just super convenient. And just like that, we have our environment sorted, and you can now start developing HTML pages, HTML websites, and you have the code, it's open inside of your browser, and you can dive deep in. That's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3, we're actually going to start styling out the Google home page using the HTML and the styles we talked about in the introduction. Alright, chapter 3, it's time to build the Google home page. Now, from chapter 2, where we initialized our environment, we have this code left over, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. So now we have a blank HTML and CSS file where we can write all of our HTML and CSS code respectively. Currently, my server is live, so if you haven't started up your server, you're going to want to open that up with Live Server. And we can see here that if I refresh the page, I just have a blank doc. Now, if we come back to our document just here, the first thing we did when we started creating this page, we're thinking Word document, was, create some of the titles and all of that kind of stuff. But Visual Studio Code actually lets us jump the gun a little bit, and they do it for us using the exclamation command. So if we just type exclamation, the IntelliSense right here brings up this HTML boilerplate code. So this is like the entry-level document, so I'm just going to hit command on the exclamation. And what that's going to do is fill out our HTML document with like the bare bones skeleton that is required when you create a proper HTML web page. So if we take a look at what we've got, we can see that we have a doc type specification up the top. This is something that you don't interact with, it just is there, don't even stress about it. The next thing we notice is that we have an HTML opening tag. At the bottom of the page, we have an HTML closing tag, and that encapsulates the head and the body tags. Now, if we remember correctly, the first thing we see here is the language attribute. So the attribute is something that goes inside the opening tag, and that is set to English. And that just lets the browser know that the default language for our HTML document is English. After that, we have the head, opening, and closing tags. And if we can recall the head, distinguishing it from the header, separate things, the head is the meta information about the page. So in here we can see we have the title, opening and closing tags, so just like we did right there. And if we look at this page currently, if we hover over the title, we can see that it's just some random code. It's like a default. But if I change this title to James is cool, we're setting the meta information about the page. I can refresh that page, and now the title has changed to James is cool. Nothing is coming up on the screen because all of the information contained inside the head is just meta information about the web page. You don't really have to worry about these two meta tags just here. We don't need to touch them. The main one that you'll want to configure is the title to get started. And then the sibling element or sibling tag of the head is the body, where the body in our Word document was the everything contained within the border. So essentially everything that actually shows up on our page. So in here we can start doing some cool stuff. We could have an H1 tag, for example. We could do a whole lot of stuff that says James is extra cool. Once again, if I refresh that, since it's inside the body, we would expect it to show up on the web page, and it absolutely does. The browser has inferred the styling, the default styling, to give the H1 tag. Since it's H1, it's extra bold, just like we would expect in here. We have a heading number 1 and it's extra bold. But what we're actually going to do is think bigger picture in terms of our HTML document. So if we come back to our Word example, the things that we actually started off with is the containers, so the exterior containers. The first one is the header. So let's go ahead and add some header tags. We have a header, opening, and closing tag. After the header, we have the main starts. So what we're going to do is underneath the header, we're going to have a main, opening, and closing tag. And then down the bottom of the page, we have a footer element. So exactly the same inside of our HTML, we're going to have a footer, opening, and closing tag. Now this is really nice for like all the semantic meaning of our HTML document. Inside of our header, if we come up to the top, we have a little title. Now this title just here is actually going to be super important, and so we're going to make it an H1 tag. This is going to be the name of the document, and since we're duplicating the Google home page, let's just see what it looks like if I click on Google. This is the Google home page. So actually, I lie. It looks like we have a navigation section up here. We don't even have the H1. So these are our navigation links. So we're actually going to swap out this H1 for a secondary container tag, which is the navigation links. Likewise in our document, for us, the navigation links were just across here. So it's not that big of a deal. Although inside of this container tag, we also have, according to the Google homepage, all of this stuff over here. And so for these 3 items, or I guess it's 4 of them, we're going to have a section. So we're going to use a section to contain these elements. And in here, inside of our nav, we can have a division for the first element. So we're going to contain that text right there. And that's going to be a text element. So we're going to have a paragraph, and that's going to say about. Inside of this navigation section, equally, we're going to have a secondary division, not a div, a division. So we're going to have about, and then after this one, we're going to have another division tag. This is also going to be a paragraph or text element, and that's going to say store. I didn't even know that Google had a store. That's hilarious. Wow, they actually have a store and they sell random products. Who would have thought? Anyway, so if we save this and refresh our page, we can see that we have about and store showing up on our screen, which is just what we'd want. We notice that the layout of them isn't one adjacent to the other like it is, but that's where our styling sheet will come in later. For now, we're just going to write some HTML and get the elements showing up on the page, looking all pretty and have some clean HTML code. Now, if we come in here, we see over there we have the Gmail and the images, a whole lot of stuff, and then a profile icon. So for that, inside of this section, we're going to have another division very similar to what we had before. And then we're going to have a paragraph tag for the Gmail. We can go ahead and duplicate that for the images. We can go ahead and duplicate it for the 9 little dots. And we can go ahead and duplicate it for the profile icon. Now, obviously, these ones here are not going to have any text elements. This text element is going to say images, and this one is also not going to have a text element. And so what I've done with these 2 lines here is I've just commented out this code. So if I save it, the divisions will exist. However, they will just be empty because this code is commented, so it's not actually read by the browser. Comments can be great inside of an HTML document to make notes for yourself, especially for things that you don't want anyone who is actually seeing the web page to see, but if you're writing the code, then you can still appreciate them. Anyway, if we take a look at our web page, that's essentially everything for the header element of the Google homepage. After that, we can come down to the main content right here, and web pages typically go in vertical orientation. You can see that is the default here for our links. As much as the header element we want it to go across, we can change that later with CSS. But yeah, the default flow for an HTML web page is vertical. So logically, the next thing vertically after the header is going to be this Google logo right here. And so for that, we're going to come into our main. We're going to have a division. And that's going to have an H1 tag that says Google and then has an exclamation mark. Now, H1 tags are very important, and just like in our Word document, you'd probably only have one header 1 element just because it's so massive. You want to be consistent like that with your HTML as well. You can have more secondary headers, more tertiary headers, and so forth, but the H1 is very special, and it's typically reserved for things that are directly about the web page. So for example, if we use the Google as the heading 1, the browser is going to understand that this is the most important thing about the web page, the largest single identifier. So we have that. After this division, we have this input bar and some icons down here. So what we're going to do is we're going to have another division, and this is going to have an input. So that's where we can collect the user information. If we remember from our demonstration, the input is a self-closing tag, which means that we have the self-closing element here. There's no opening and closing tag. Instead of having the closing tag like we do here, we just put that slash at the end. So we can go ahead and have our input just like that. After that, we're going to have another division, and this is going to have these 2 little buttons down the end. So we have a search by voice and a search by image. So this is going to have a button. Now this is going to have an icon in it, and we can come back to that later. And then we're going to have a secondary button that has an icon in it as well. I spelled both of those wrong. How random is that? So since we can see that they're meant to be clicked, they're obviously going to be button elements. One thing that I should have mentioned above is that these divisions right here are actually links to external pages. All of them are, in fact. And so what we're going to do is change them from being regular divisions, and instead we're going to swap them out to be anchors, because they create links that anchor to exterior pages. So we can just swap all these divisions out for anchors, and the paragraph tag is pretty happy to sit within those anchor tags. Now, as we saw in the example back here, the anchor tag has some children content, which is what displays on the page, and it also has an href, which is the link to the external page. So we just have to make sure that in our anchor tags, we add an attribute. We can go ahead and add it to all of them at the same time. It has to be added to the opening tag, and we're going to set the href equal to, and in here we can say add a link later. So if we save our page and look at our document, we can see that HTML actually has some default styling for some of these elements. And so these anchor tags have now made them actually look like clickable links. We have our big Google, we have our input field, and we have our two icon buttons that we can come back and style later. After that, after this stuff just here, we're going to have another division. So if we take a look at our divisions quickly, we have a division that separates this, we have a division that separates the input, and now we're going to have a division that separates these two buttons just here. So in here we're going to have another button, and this is going to have a paragraph tag that says Google search, and we're going to duplicate that, and this one is going to say I'm feeling lucky. Nice and easy. Once again, we can save that, refresh this page, and our icons show up, which is very convenient. After that division, we have another one. So we're going to have a div just here, and this is going to contain a paragraph that says Google offered in, and just in here, we're going to have a span, which if you recall, is the inline space container. So it's the only space container or the only spacing tag that we're allowed to have within a paragraph. For example, we couldn't use a div like this, and it just allows us to apply special styles exceptionally and only to the contents of here, and the remainder of the paragraph tag can be something else. So in here we're going to say MA, can we get a special A? I guess so, ORI. Very nice, that's our paragraph. And then finally down here we have the footer element of the page. You can see it just there. It's a darker color. We have this little section which locates our, which is our location. And then we just have some links down the bottom. So that's all going to be inside of the footer. For that top line, so everything above this line, I'm going to create my first section. This only has a paragraph element, so just a singular text item that says New Zealand. And then underneath that, I'm going to have my secondary section. And this one has some buttons that are separated on either side. So you can see we've got some there and then we've got some there. So what we're going to do is we're going to have each grouping of buttons inside of a division. The first division has advertising, business, and how search works. So in here we can have an anchor tag, because I believe that these anchor to external pages. So the first one is going to say advertising, and then we can go ahead and duplicate this anchor tag multiple times, 3 times for that particular division, and that's advertising, business, and how search works. We can see that we also have 3 links on the other one, so we can just copy this whole division and paste that again and swap that out for a privacy. Swap this one out for a terms, and swap this one out for a settings. And that's pretty much all the HTML that we need for our document. And if we come in here and refresh the page, we can see that we have all the elements. They obviously don't look very attractive at the minute, but we can change that with some CSS cascading style sheets. And now, speaking of styling, the first thing to know is that HTML actually comes in with a built-in system for styling documents. Now, it's not commonplace, but it is good to know. And essentially, every HTML tag allows you to add a style attribute. And in here, we can add styles in the same language as CSS, but it doesn't actually cascade. So we could, for example, set the color of this H1 tag to green. And now we see that the color of that particular element changes. We could go ahead and change the font family, and we could set it to sans serif, and that's going to change the font. Now this is known as an inline style, and once again it's not best practice, but it is just good to know that you have that ability. The biggest downside of inline styles is that it only applies the style to that particular element. So if I wanted to have all of these buttons styled the same, I would have to copy that style attribute into all of them, which is just going to look super jank and not very nice. So instead what we do is we use CSS, and we can use CSS in our page by coming up to the head of our document. So this is all the meta section, which isn't displayed on our page, but it gives the browser context about everything. And we can add a style opening and closing tag. Now this is one way that you can add CSS. We will get to this styles.css sheet in a second, But what we could do if we had a small document or we were just getting started is we can have this style tag, and in here we can start writing some CSS. Let's say I wanted to apply that green color to a button this time, but I wanted that style to cascade across every single button. Well, what I can do inside of the style tag is I can say, all right, target the button, and then I can add the curly parentheses, and in here I can write the same style. So here is the name or the parameter that determines which style, and here is the value that I want to give it. And so now we can see that the style has cascaded across every single button in our document. Likewise, if I wanted to change the color of all of the anchor tags, I can select the anchor element and I can set the color to a lavender. That's going to change all the colors of our anchor elements to lavender. Now that is super cool, and it's not the only way that we can style elements, but it is a good start. However, adding the style tag in here is going to eventually get really large by the time we're finished styling this document. So we're going to move all of our styles into this styles.css sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the button and anchor tag styles. You can see everything reverts, and I'm going to paste it into the sheet here. We can see that pasting it into the sheet, the styles no longer apply to our document. But what we can do instead is inside of the head, we can create a link tag that has a relationship equal to style sheet. And in here we can set an H reference, which is basically, how to locate the style sheet, and we can just set it as styles.css. This is going to be a self-closing tag. And now if I save that document, this code doesn't show up on the screen, but our HTML document knows to read the styles in from our styles.css. So that just means that everything we add inside of our styles.css is applied to our document. So now that we have our two files working in conjunction, we can go ahead and close our navigation, and we can finish styling our Google home page. The first thing we're going to start off is with the background of the entire document. We can see they just do not match. So the way that we can do that is coming into our styles.css. I'm going to remove this, and I want to select everything. So in this example here, it's like I want to change the background color of our entire page. Now we learned earlier that that is the body of our document. So consequently, inside of the styles.css, we can select the body tag, which once again is containing all of the visible information, and we can say background is equal to dark blue, for example. And we can see that that consequently changes the background color, but we're actually going to use what's known as a hex code, which is a 6-digit alphanumeric essentially word that determines exactly which color. And we're going to say pound 0F172A. It's going to be slightly darker, but that's all good. It kind of matches, and that's all that matters. And now the next thing we can see is that our text is not very readable, so we're also going to set the color of all text elements within inside our page to white. So suddenly everything is readable again. The other thing we're going to do is, you can see here we have a few default styles from the the default of the HTML elements, for example, the anchor tag. The anchor tags are fine for this moment, but there's an amount of padding and margin that is good to reset on every document. And the way that we're going to do that is use the asterisk. Now this is something that you only want to do once at the top of your style sheet. And using the asterisk essentially means just select every single HTML element on the page and apply this to all of them. Inside of here, we're going to unset 3 particular parameters, or essentially just set them to 0. The first one is the margin. We'll learn more about that shortly. The second one is the padding, and then the third one is the box sizing. We're going to set to border box. And we can see that just removed all of the default margin and padding from everything in our document and pushed it up into the corner. This really just means we have a blank canvas. So now that everything is sitting hard up against the corner, the next thing we're going to do is push it inwards a little bit. Now this is where 2 particular styles come in handy. The first one is what's known as a margin, and the second one's what's known as a padding. So they do very similar things. And essentially, the way to think about both of them is in terms of a container. If we have let's say we get a package, and the package or the parcel is the container. The padding is how much padding is on the inside of the box or the parcel that prevents the goods from hitting the outside. So essentially, that's space inside of the container. So inside of our HTML document, here we have the header element up the top. I think we can actually come in here and do something pretty clever. And if we select and if we have a look at the header just here, we can see that selects that entire space. So if we wanted to add padding, that would push all these items in. The header is the exterior of this box. And so we could try adding a pixel amount, which is the number of pixels. Let's get rid of the margin for a second. And we can see that now that pushes everything in our entire document in, except we have applied that to the body, so it's applied it to everything in this container. Now the green space around the edge is what is represented as our padding. That's probably too big, so I'm going to drop that down to 14 pixels. And now we've kind of pushed everything in just like they have in the header of the document here. The next thing we're going to do with the body is actually just set a minimum height. As you might have guessed, you can set a height, you can set a width, and you can also set a minimum height. Now for this, we're going to say 100% of the viewport height. Now just like we have pixels right here as a unit of size, we can also have a view height, which is a slightly more responsive unit. And it essentially just means 100% of the available view height. So now we can see where before the bottom of our body would end about here, now it's just occupying all the available space. So that's looking pretty good. The next thing we want to do is change our little anchor tags just here so that they space out across the top. So we can do that by selecting the header element inside of our HTML, and we're going to give it what's known as a display. So the display parameter, CSS parameter, essentially just tells the container how to display its contents. And we're going to set it to a value of flex. Now flex is just a style of display that's essentially, just think of it as flexible containers, containerization, and the default for flex is containers in a row. So it's like you're stacking boxes into a truck. We stack them in, we push one behind another. And if we save that, we can see that now we have our first division just here. If we look inside of the head, we have our nav, and then we have our section, and they are two containers adjacent to one another in a horizontal. The next thing we can do is set a parameter called align items. Now this essentially aligns how the elements within this row sit in respect to the boundaries of that container. So in this particular case, centering them just means that if the height of, this doesn't really matter, but it's just an example. If I set the nav to height of 1,000 pixels, that's way too big. Let's say 400 pixels, not 4,000. If we come back just here, we can see that the height of our navigation is huge, and we can see that the height of our section just here is centered horizontally. Well, I guess technically it's vertical within that horizontal row. There's a couple of other parameters for this. If you want to know the other options, I recommend coming over to Ch.3 schools. They essentially have every single CSS parameter that you can use and all the different options, but the most common examples, center is going to be the one used the most. The alternative that we could use is stretch. And now anyway, I'm going to remove that just there. So we've aligned our items in the center. The other thing that we notice is that these ones need to go over to the far end. So we can do that by saying justify content. Now justify content is very similar to align items in terms of its functionality, and these three styles get used in conjunction very commonly. Where align items aligned everything in the vertical plane, justify content justifies it in the horizontal plane. And that's assuming the direction of our flex display is as a row, which is the default. We could actually set a flex direction to a column, and that's going to lay everything out in a column arrangement, just like we can see here, but that's obviously not what we're looking for. So we're just going to leave it as the default. The point of mentioning that is that when we have it as a column, the aligning of these two styles just swaps, and essentially you just have to think about it on a different axis. With the justify content, the default is obviously one next to another. We're going to say space between. Here we can see a couple of the default options coming up. Space around, we'll put them both there's even spacing around all of them. Space between is just going to push them to either side of the page. So we're kind of getting closer to this layout just here. The next thing is that these anchors within the navigation in the section obviously are still in the default vertical alignment. And we can go ahead and fix that by selecting the nav. And at the same time, we can select a section. So we're going to hit 2 with the same set of styles, so we can duplicate them with the comma. And we're going to give these guys a display of flex as well, and we're also going to align them center. We don't have to justify the content because it's no worries if they sit right next to each other. We can see that totally works. However, the next parameter we're going to add, we don't want them sitting right next to one another, so we can add a gap which logically splits them up, and we can set that equal to 14 pixels so that it matches the gap that we added as a padding around the entire container. Now that is absolutely brilliant. So the next thing we have to do is actually figure out how we can make these anchor tags look a bit nicer. Now over here we have some slightly different styling for each of them. These ones are pretty gray, these ones are pretty white. So what we're going to do is use what's known as a class. Now, up until this point, we have used the tag to select and style that particular element. A class can be added to any element essentially as an attribute. So just in here, for both of these anchor tags, I'm going to give them a class, and this is going to be gray link. So we've given them the attribute class, and we've set that value to gray link. Equally, you can have multiple classes for a particular element. All you have to do is space separate them. And for these ones over here, I'm also going to give them a class, and that's going to be a white link. Now, unfortunately, styling those elements isn't as simple as just typing white link, but it's almost that simple. To select a class, all we do is we use the period, and now it's going to match anything with this particular class and give it the style we desire. So if we come back to our document, we know that the white links need to have a color of white, and we can see that it selects the white links specifically and makes them white. Now the reason we didn't just select the anchor tag is because if we said color white to the anchor tag, that's a problem because we can't distinguish between this set of anchor tags and this set of anchor tags. So classes allow us to be a little bit more specific with our styles. Consequently, we can have the gray link, and we can give that a color of gray. I'm actually going to make that light gray, just so it's a little bit brighter on the screen. And now we can see the difference. We can see that all of them have an underline that we're not so interested in. So we could select them all in unison, say anchors, and we can say text decoration. The underline is known as a decoration, and we can say unset, and that's just going to unset the default for that. So now we have the underline disappear. The next thing we're going to do is learn how to style hover events. So in here we can see that when we hover over these elements, we get a nice underline. So what we can do is we can select all of the anchors because it applies to all of them. We can use a semicolon and say on hover, we want to add the text decoration and just make it underline again. So now for the default state, it's going to have no underline. However, when we hover over those elements, we can see the underline show up for all of them. So that's pretty simple as to how we can add hover effects to our document. So that's looking pretty good just there. The next thing we have to do is get this Google element somehow in the middle of the page. And what I like to do in my documents is come back up to the body and give the body a display of flex, just like we have done down here. However, if we save that, we can see that it changes the default layout of the page to the horizontal direction. It's not what we want, so we're just going to go ahead and set the flex direction to column. And that's kind of back to the way it was, except now we can take advantage of the flex display, which gives us lots of additional styling power. We do not need to add the align item center and justify content space between, but if we did, we could essentially get a very centered display, but yeah, it's just not that important for us in this moment. However, what we are going to do in here is separate all of these elements out by our standard 14 pixel gap. And that's just going to round off that nice even padding, I guess you could call it, even though we've made it up with different things in the heading just there. So that's for the body. Now the next thing we're going to do is a little bit complicated, so just stick with me on it. If we set the body, which is everything in here, to have a minimum height of 100% of the screen, that means that the body is down to the bottom of the screen. What we want is for this footer section to get pushed to the bottom of the screen, because typically footers appear at the bottom. And the way that we can do that is by telling the main section, which is all of this main content here, and consequently the main tag, to be space greedy. Now, if we've added a flex display to the parent container, which is the body, any direct children we have, we can say, because the main is a direct child, remember if we look at our index.html, here we have the header, we have the main, and we have the footer. These are all the direct children. So I can select the main, the body has a display of flex, and I can set the flex to 1. Now this parameter here, once again, only works if the parent has a flex display, but it tells the child, this particular child, to be as space greedy as possible. We could set the flex number on the header and the footer, but typically the lower the better. You can make it in ratios, so if the header and the footer had, a value of 2, then this would take up twice as much space of them, and it kind of works itself out. But if we only set it on the main, this is going to occupy as much space as possible. And so now the main container is taking up as much of that 100 view height as possible and pushing the footer to the bottom of the page. So now that we've made the main section as greedy with space as possible, we can go ahead and also give it a display of flex. We can give it a flex direction of column because we want the column direction. Now that hasn't changed, but what we could do with this particular one is go ahead and say align item center and justify content center. Now using the center parameters for both of the vertical and horizontal alignments is obviously going to center all of that content in the middle of the page. So now you can see we're kind of getting things centered in the middle of the page. The other thing I'm going to do, we can see that there's a bit of a consistent gap between all of these elements, so I'm going to go ahead and add that in. We're going to set the gap on all of these items to maybe 32 pixels. That looks a bit too big. Let's say 24 pixels. That's going to spread them out in the middle of the page. With that, we can go ahead and target the Google logo. Now, if we look at this Google logo, it's obviously way bigger, so we can go ahead and target the Google logo. If we see, we can target it as an H1, and it is in fact the only H1 we have. However, if we had multiple ones of them, we could go ahead and add a class. So this is going to be header text. The other thing I could do is add a secondary attribute, which is known as the ID, and I could say header logo. Now, the one thing to note about the ID attribute is that every ID for each tag that has an ID has to be unique. So I can only use this ID on one tag in my entire document. It has to be unique. So let's just leave that like that. Now we can come back in here and select the header text, and we can give that a font size. So this is how we size the font, and we're going to set that to some unknown value. Now for font sizes, there's a couple of units. We could set it to 14 pixels. That's going to be really small. Typically for fonts, we use a relative sizing system. So the first one is EM. Equally, there's REM. They both have unique meanings, but they're often pretty similar. You can use them interchangeably. I'm just going to go with EM, and I'm going to set that to 4EM. So that's going to be a bit bigger than normal, and it's actually pretty equivalent, to be fair. So that's pretty good. The other thing I'm going to do is come up to our anchor tags, and I'm going to also set the font size on them to 0.8 EM. The reason I know I want to use 0.8 is because it's a relative scale. So I want it to be 0.8 of the default essentially. So if I save that, I can see that brings them down to about 80% of what they were originally. Now, I quite like that font, and we can see that the font semi-matches some of the Google logos. However, the other thing we have to do is change the font of every other element on this page. And we can do that for now by coming into the body of the document just here. And we're going to set a font family on everything to sans serif with a backup of Times New Roman. So if we change that, that just changes everything to the sans serif font. And then once again, I can come back down to my header text and set the font family back to Times New Roman. Now, one thing to note here is that this class took priority in terms of the font family over the body. And so essentially we do have a style priority where this is going to set the font family to sans serif for every child element in the entire page, unless the child element has a styling of its own, and then it will assume that style. Now, one interesting thing, here we've selected the class to style it. What if I selected the H1 and gave it a font family of sans serif? We notice that it doesn't actually adopt that even when these are both styling the exact same element. And so it's always good to know that the class takes priority over the actual tag selector. However, if I change that to header logo, which if you recall was the ID, and the ID has to be unique, remember, we can see that the ID selection inside of the CSS sheet takes priority above the class. So the priority system is the ID, then the class, then the tag, then the parents. Now we can style or select by the ID using the pound as a prefix. However, it's not that common, but it's there if you need it. The only way that we could overwrite that default hierarchy is by adding the important flag to something that was lower on the hierarchy, and then once again that would take precedence, but that's not really something you have to worry about, and we can go ahead and remove that. So with the Google styled, the next thing we have to do is this input just here. Now, one thing that I didn't consider before is that we have this little logo right here in addition to these buttons on the other side. And so I'm going to come back and find the division that contains all of this information, and I'm going to have a div just here, and this is going to have the icon as well. So now we have an icon, and then we have two icons afterwards. However, obviously they are in the vertical alignment or the vertical orientation at the moment because we have not styled it to be otherwise. Now all of these were contained within this div right here. So I'm going to give this one a class of search bar. So we can go ahead and select that search bar style just in here, and we can say display of flex because we know that the default is horizontal, and now it arranges the items in a horizontal style. The next thing I'm going to do is set a width of 800 pixels because we know that this one's quite wide. It's actually super wide. And we can see it reaches a maximum width approximately there. So I'm just going to guess that's about 800 pixels. We're going to save that. And now we have the 800 pixel long search input. And we can target that just here. So you can see it's actually overflowing the page because it's so long. Now that is not very responsive web design. And this is actually going to be a huge lesson. If you want to create responsive web pages, what you have to do is design for the mobile screen first. So this is pretty equivalent to a mobile screen at the moment. Equally, if we went to the developer tools, we can select this toggle device toolbar, and that is literally going to put us onto a mobile device screen. We can see that the page overflows and it looks all jank, which means that our website is not responsive. So if we can make it look good on a mobile screen, then it will be guaranteed to look good on any larger device. Going in the other direction can be very difficult, and you can't guarantee that on a mobile screen everything will fit in. So the way that we're going to deal with this responsive issue is that I'm actually going to set the width to 100% of the parent element. Now what that means is that the width of our little search bar, we can actually see the class there, .searchBar, is going to occupy 100% of the parent element, which I think is the main, and the main we can see pretty much takes up the whole width. So the search bar is just going to occupy 100% of that width, as opposed to a pixel amount or a viewport. 100% is a pretty good way to make sure that a child element only occupies the maximum compared to the parent instead of the entire page, so it's a good style to be aware of. However, the issue with doing it in this particular way is that as I continue to upsize the page, the width is going to get wider and wider. So we can just go ahead and set a cap on this, a maximum width of 800 pixels. And what that means is that our width is going to increase until it hits that max width, and then it's not going to continue to get ridiculously large. And I might actually bring that down to a 700 just so you can really appreciate that effect. You can see we hit the maximum width there, and it moves into the center. The last thing we have to do is if we set the maximum width, especially with a flex display, is that typically everything is going to be left justified. And this is where the margin comes in. So where padding is that internal spacing between the exterior of the container and the sub-contents, the margin is the opposite. The margin is like I have a package and I want to specify a distance between it and a neighboring package. So if I wanted to keep every other package 30 centimeters away, then I would use a margin. So think of it as exterior spacing. Now what I want is when we reach the maximum width, I want to make sure that the margin on either side is of auto length, so it will basically adjust each side so they're matching, and that is going to consequently self-center our element. And now if we inspect once again, that just means, it's going to be a bit awkward because I don't know that the screen size will work, but if I zoom out a whole lot, we can see that this element right there has an auto margin, and so it's auto-centered itself around everything. Now one thing that we didn't want is for it to have this vertical auto margining. We don't want that vertical orange, we just want the horizontal orange. And so what we can do is we can actually set the vertical margin to 0, and now that brought everything back together, but we have maintained that horizontal margin. So in the margin, the first parameter that we have is the vertical spacing. The second one is the horizontal margin, or if we only have one, then it just applies it to all sides. So that's pretty good to know. Now the next thing we need to do is actually make our input look half decent. So I'm going to zoom this back in to the default size, 100%. And what we're going to do is we are going to start off with the input. Now inputs come with a lot of default styling, and so we're going to get rid of all of it. And to that we're going to say background, we're going to set it to transparent because currently it is white. And now we can see that that goes away. The next thing we have is an outline. We're going to set that to none. We can see we also have a border on it, so I'm going to say border unset. Now the border goes away. Most things don't really come with an outline, the input is just particular, however the border is a common style. Now that we have gotten rid of all of the default styles, we're also going to have to set the color of the text so that it's white. We have a black background, and now we can see we have that white text coming up. In here, since we've set a display of flex and all the elements are horizontally aligned, and we know that it has a sufficient width, we actually want to once again use that flex parameter and make the input as greedy as possible. So now this input element is going to occupy all of the horizontal space that it can get its hands on up to our maximum width, and it consequently pushed our buttons down the far end. The other thing we have to note is we want a gap between the elements within our search bar, so that's the buttons and the input. So since we're using a flex display, we can just set that to 14 pixels. Now we have our icon, and it's a bit separate from the input, which is a bit separate from the buttons. Now what we need to do is add the border around the element. We need to add some padding to the input because we can see there's a little bit of a gap just there. And we have to add some hover effects so that when we hover, the background color changes and the border goes away. So we can do that really easily. First by saying border, we're going to set it to be 1 pixel. We're going to set it to be a solid border as opposed to like dashed or something else. and we're going to make it gray. So we can see that show up. That obviously doesn't look as good as this one, but that's no worries. The next thing we're going to do is set a padding on this particular element. We want the padding between the exterior of the container and these items to increase. And so we can say, let's have 8 pixels in here. And just like that, it's increased and we have that padding effect. I might even just go up to the 14, make it nice and big. And you can see we're one step closer to what we have just here. It's possibly a little bit big now, so I might bring it down to a 10. The next thing we have to do is set a radius on the border, and we can do that with the border radius property, and we're going to set that to 10 pixels, maybe 24 pixels. I think that looks pretty good. Now it actually looks like we could increase that padding back up to 14 pixels, to be honest. So that's very good. And now the next thing we have to do is set some hover effects. So we can once again target the search bar, set the hover parameter, and when we hover, we want the border color. So instead of just adding them all in one style, we can actually sub-select them, and we're just going to set the color specifically to transparent and the background to a dark gray. So now when we hover, we can see that the border goes away and the background color changes, just like it does in here, although obviously the colors are all wrong. Now, if we actually wanted to steal the colors legitimately used in this web page, what we can do is inspect this web page, and we could click on the body, for example, and we can come into the style section just here. You can see that they actually set the default padding and margin to 0 just like we did, and we can copy the color, so that's pretty cool. We can select the color just there, and we can come back up to the body of our document and set the color. If I just paste that properly. If you're using a hex code, you have to remember to have the pound at the start. It's just going to set the color of our page, so that's a bit closer. And I think what I might do for the input color, because this is way too light, is just see if I can make this a bit brighter. And the way that I'm going to do that is actually by coming to the Tailwind CSS colors. They just have really nice gradients, and I'm going to go ahead and copy the 700 one right there, and now we can see that that has totally fixed our problem. So the next thing we have to do is our little buttons just here. The buttons are going to be pretty easy. We can select these buttons by giving this div just here. We can call these, give this a class of search buttons. For the search buttons, we can come in here and we can select them. Now the search buttons, that's actually the container, so I lied. So let's just change that. So that's the search buttons container. We could theoretically select the buttons individually, but I'm just going to do this for some variety. And we're going to select any button tags within the search button container class. Now for that, we're going to give them a padding of 14 pixels. We're going to give them a border radius of 8 pixels. We can see that the background color is similar to the one that we used for the input, so we're going to set the background to that same 700 color that we used earlier. Link to this will be in the description down below. Set that just there. Let's have a look at how that looks. So we're getting closer. It looks like perhaps the padding is too much. So what I'm going to do is actually set a vertical and horizontal padding specifically. So I'm going to bring the vertical down to maybe a 6 and the horizontal to a 10. So that's nice and easy. It looks like they have a default border, so I'm going to unset that. We're going to have to set the color to be white. Now I think that the buttons are too small, so I might actually pop that back up to a 10 horizontal and a 14 vertical. I think the border radius should come down to about a 4 pixel. And by gosh, that's looking pretty close. The last thing I'm going to do is select the search button container alone, give it a display of flex, align items, center, and just so I can give it a gap of maybe 8 pixels. Actually, I lie, let's make that a 14 pixels. Just going to push them apart a little bit, so we saw that just there. Now if we look at the hover effect, we can see we get a border on hover, so we can very easily make that. We just select this right here, just like we have, and we add the hover to the element that is actually doing the hovering. And all we have to do here is set a border to 1 pixel solid dark gray. I might try. Now, one thing that happens here is we can see we get some little jank movements, and we don't want that. And so how we're going to do that is, instead of setting the border to unset, we're going to give it a solid border so that it already exists and it doesn't have to add it. We're just by default going to set it to transparent instead. So now it's just going to change the color of the border instead of adding a border and resizing everything. The other thing we know is that we need a different cursor, so we can go ahead and set the style of cursor. It's going to have a cursor set to pointer. So the pointer is the click. Now we have that. Easy breezy. And honestly, we're getting pretty close. We've got our little input. We'll come and do the icons last. After that, we're going to set this Google is offered in Moldy. For that, we only have, we notice that the text is very small, and we also notice that the Moldy is blue. So I'm going to select that section. I'm going to call this, give it a class of language selection. We can go ahead and select that in here using the period. And we can give that a font size of 0.8 EM, maybe a 0.9 EM, so it's a bit smaller. And we can select the span specifically that is within that element, and we can set the color to blue, and that targets the Moldy. However, that is not good. We'll say light blue. I wonder what color that is. It's like maybe a sky doesn't exist. Let's just say cyan for the sake of it. It's not quite the same, but that at least stands out. The last thing we're going to do is come down to these links in our footer. So for that, I'm just going to select the footer element. Now, if we remember, the footer contained 2 sections, so we need them vertically arranged. So we're going to give it a display of flex, a flex direction of column. It's going to keep that vertical alignment. Very nice. The next thing we're going to do is select the sections that exist within the footer. And if we only want the selections that are the direct descendants, we can use this little alligator mouth here in this particular direction. So that's going to select the 2 direct children sections. So that's this one and this one. And we can go ahead and give that a padding of 14 pixels each. So that's going to space them out a little bit. For each of them, we can give them a border of 1 pixel solid dark gray. Now we have the borders. However, we note a problem. The border actually extends all the way across. And this is an interesting little problem because it means we're going to have to come up and change, or essentially remove, the padding at the top of our document if we want them to extend to the exterior, which they now do. We'll fix that in a second. However, we're going to also be a bit clever about the border. And so we are only going to select the last child. So that's going to select any section that is the last child of its parent. So the secondary section, and we're going to also set it so that it's a border top and not just both borders. The padding, however, needs to apply to both of them, so we'll set the footer and just generally select the section, put the padding in there. Now we've got padding on both of them. We've lost the padding to the entire document, but we can fix that very easily by coming up to our header, adding the padding of 14 pixels in there, and then coming to our main and just adding the padding in to here as well, except we're only going to add it horizontally here, not vertically. And that's because I think we have a gap on our body of 14 pixels, which will take care of it for us. And so now our links are back and spaced all nicely and everything is happy. And our line extends to the exterior of our page. After that, we're going to come back into the footer, specifically the last child. We're going to give this a display of flex align item center, And once again, if we look at this example, the two sets of buttons spread out, except this time with a space around instead of between. So that's going to be justify space around. And now if we come back into our page, we can see we have the exact same effect just there. Nice and easy. We're going to need some more space between the links themselves, and we can do that by selecting the divisions within those sections. So we can say, now I'm not going to add more styles onto this, more subselectors. I'm just going to give these a class each that's called footer link. We can go ahead and select the footer link, and we can just say, give it a display of flex as we always do, align the items center, keep the orientation horizontal, and just give it a gap of maybe 8 pixels. Let's spread them out a little bit. I might just keep with our 14 pixels. Now we've got some space between our links. Now that's looking brilliant. We've lost the color to our Google, so let's just come back up to our Google and set the color to white. For our links down the very bottom, we're going to have to give them a cursor pointer, so I'm going to select the footer link and the subsequent anchor tags and say cursor is equivalent to pointer. So that solves that problem. Now the last thing we're going to have to do is actually swap out this icon for a legitimate icon, likewise with these ones, and add that one up the top. Now the way that we're going to do that is by coming over to something called Font Awesome Icons and Font Awesome CDN. Now the Font Awesome CDN, this will be linked in the description down below. This is essentially an exterior package that we can incorporate into our code. We're going to go ahead and copy this top link tag, come into our index.html and paste it inside of the head underneath our other link tag right there. It's a whole big thing. And now that we've pasted that in, that means that we can come over to Font Awesome Icons, which, let's just actually Google that. Font Awesome Icons. Come to Google and we can click on this link right here. And this is essentially just an icons package. And now if we typed in search, because I think it's a search icon just there, we can look at their free icons. We see we have a magnifying glass, and we can go ahead and copy this HTML tag right there and literally plonk it straight into our code in the appropriate section. So we're looking for our search bar. We have the first division with an icon. We're going to swap that out, and now you can see we have our icon right there. After that, if we look over here, we have a recorder and then we have a camera. So we're going to do the exact same for the other ones. We're going to say recorder. I think it would probably be microphone, to be honest. Oh, that did the trick, microphone. So we're going to copy this one and we're going to paste it inside of this button. Nice and easy. Now we have that showing up, and then we're going to do the exact same with the camera, which happens to be right there. How convenient. And we can replace the camera. And so now we have these icons showing up. These buttons just here have some default styling, which we can go and resolve immediately. So for that, I'm just going to give them both a class of icon button. That means that we can come into our CSS. Let's place these styles around the actual search bar. So that's going to be the input, the search bar just here. So I'm going to select the, icon button. Select the icon button. We're going to give that a background of transparent, a border of none, a color of white, and a font size of 1.2 EM. It's going to boost them up a little bit. Now they look more in vogue with our other icon just over there. The other thing I'm going to do is give this a class icon button container, because it contains the icon buttons that we have. Let's save that, and just above it I'm going to give that a display of flex, align the items center, and give it a gap of 14 pixels, and that's just going to spread them out a little bit. And just like that, we're down to the final step, which is to duplicate this top corner. Now here we have 6 dots. That's not going to be easy. So what I'm going to do is dots. I wonder if that comes up. I mean, this is close enough. Technically it's Braille. Don't judge me. We're just going to use it. So we are going to come into our HTML, come up to the header section just here, and we're going to add that in. That's going to show up. Look, we have our 6 dots as an anchor tag. What I will do for that one is also make sure it has the class of white link, because it just needs it. So there are our 6 dots, and then the last one is going to be a little image. Now for images, what we're going to do is come into our folder directory, and we're going to add a public folder. Now this is best practice for serving up static content. And what I'm going to do is come into Google, and I'm going to say corgi profile. Let's say corgi face. Oh, it's such a cute dog. That is perfect. That's just, no, actually, this one's far better. We're going to open the image in a new tab, and we're going to copy this link. Well, actually, no, because we created the folder, we're going to open the image in the new tab, and we're actually going to save the image, and I'm going to call it corgi. So now that we have saved that image inside of our public directory, we can see that that image is there. And now what I can do is I can use the fabled image tag. I can give it a source, which is the directory, the path to the image. So then we add public corgi. I'm going to give it an alt, which is the description of the image, corgi profile pic, and it's a self-closing tag that shows up absolutely massive, which is not what we want. However, we can come back up to the header, close that. Where's the header? Here's the header. It's going to be header section image, just to make sure we get the right one. And we're going to give it a maximum width of, let's try 48 pixels. Perfect. We're also going to give it a border radius of 50%. That's going to make it circular. And we can give it a border of 2 pixel solid cyan. It's not quite the same as Google, but it will do the trick. And I might just bring this down to a 40 pixels. And so just like that, we have pretty much duplicated the Google home page. Looks absolutely beautiful. I noticed that these two don't have any cursor pointer elements on them. So let's just quickly add them. Icon button, we just want to give that a cursor pointer. That changes that. So now we get the little cursor clicky element on them. And the best thing about it is that the entire page is super responsive. So if we click on that, we can see that it sizes down real nicely, nothing overflows, and everyone is happy days. But actually that's a lie, to be honest. I don't know if you can see it, but just down the bottom here in the footer, we see that these links don't quite work. So we're going to come in here and use something that is known as a media query. Now a media query, we type in the @media, then we use the circular parentheses. You always want to add this at the bottom of the document. And we're going to set the minimum width to 540 pixels. And then we're going to open that up with the curly braces. Now, one thing I did in this footer section is I gave it a display of flex, which means that the flex direction by default is row, which is causing this issue. Now, if we wanted to stick to our mobile first design principles, we would actually want to set the flex direction to column. And we can see that fixes my problem perfectly. However, now when I increase the page size, it doesn't work. And that's where this media query comes in. We can select this element and we can apply a style that takes over as soon as we meet the minimum width of 540 pixel requirement. So now I can set the flex direction to row, and we can see, well, you can't see, I can see that it jumps them back across. So if I come down, we can see it adjusts based on the size of the screen. But once again, we're back to a totally responsive document, which is absolutely awesome. It looks great. And that brings us to the end of chapter 3. Now, chapter 4, the final chapter that is required for you to have amazingly beautiful, responsive websites on the internet, is to be able to host them, deploy them, and send links to your family and friends. And to do that for free, we are going to come over to a website called Netlify. Now for this, you'll want to create an account. I already have an account and I'm consequently logged in. Inside of here, you will find a Add New Site button. We want to deploy the project manually, and we will see a drag and drop file. It says drag and drop your site output folder. So what I'm going to do, I think if I just copy all of these elements, drag and drop them, please drop a folder. Okay, so we're actually going to have to come up a directory, select the HTML demo folder, drop the whole folder, and that is going to upload it to the internet. With that folder uploaded, it's going to deploy our code. And I think somewhere post-processing, it looks like everything is finished. We should be able to come back to all of our projects. Let's see, sites. And just here, you can see you have a site. It's your deployed code. We can see a little preview. And here we have a link for it. It says it's that manual deploy. If we click on this link, our website is now live on the internet. And this is a link that you could send to anyone, and they would be able to access your work and see your amazing responsive web design. Now that is super cool. It means that you can post this in your portfolio projects. This is definitely some code that I would recommend uploading to your GitHub to show off to prospective employers. And with that, my friends, we have pretty much reached the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have learned lots and lots. If you've enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe. Love that support. And that brings me to the announcement at the end of the video. If you aren't already aware, I have a Discord for learning to code. I'd highly recommend you join. But more specifically, there is a sub-channel called Share Your Projects. Now, should you join the Discord and post your projects in that channel, there is a chance I'll be selecting 5 to 10 of them to make a review video, which will go on YouTube on my channel. And I will give pretty comprehensive feedback about all the things you did well, room for improvement, what to do next, and further suggestions. So if you want your projects to be included inside of a video, be sure to join the Discord, post your project to that particular channel, and then don't forget to once again subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can stay tuned for that video coming out in the next few weeks. If the video is already out, I'll be doing more of them, so be sure to still join, post your projects, and there's heaps of time to review. Anyway, once again, love you guys. Thank you for watching. Peace out. Bye. Learning to code? If so, be sure to check out the Small James Web Development Roadmap. Link is in the description down below, or dive straight in with these videos.